I wanted to kick things off. My name is Steve Hutchins, and I work for Aptiv. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, from the business perspective, creating a global manufacturing intelligence portal. So first of all, I know many of you are thinking, well, what is Aptiv? Aptiv is a fairly new name. Some of you may be familiar with the name Delphi. We used to be called Delphi before that. Before that, we were the captive electronics supplier for General Motors. So we have a very long history of innovation. Back to 1936, we put the first radio in a vehicle. We started computerized engine control, head-up display, anti-lock brake controllers, et cetera. So we have a long history of innovation, but with some changes with our name and some other stuff, we're starting to focus more on advanced mobility solutions. So Aptiv today looks at themselves as a company that's wanting to address the urban mobility challenges. So if we look at some of the information in the infographic up here, you look at population increases over the next decade, the freight increases, et cetera. And so moving into mobility automation is kind of what you've heard. So if Aptiv as an organization, we're about a $13 billion company, 147,000 employees across the globe. And today, our portfolio consists mainly of what we call the smart vehicle architecture and also the mobility solutions. So on the architecture side, that's the software that you have in the vehicle across all the different modules, the sensing and controllers that control that, also kind of the nervous system that's in the vehicle. So every car, as you're probably aware, has kind of miles and miles of cabling and so on, connectors, et cetera. So we handle all that. And then the side that you probably hear more about in the press or may have heard a little bit about is really the mobility piece. And so that's where historically we've done a lot with active safety, with radar, camera systems, et cetera, for things like adaptive cruise control and other items. But we're really starting to focus quite a bit on automated driving. So on that front, in 2015, we were actually the first company to take a vehicle automated from coast to coast. So we went from San Francisco to New York City, 3,400 miles, and 99% of it plus was completely automated. So as of this year now, we have a fleet of over 50 vehicles in Las Vegas. So if any of you guys have been in Vegas recently, or you're going there soon, and you use Lyft, you may be presented on your device with the opportunity to drive in one of our vehicles. So we have over 50 BMWs there that are managed by Lyft and using our technology and our hardware. And so we continue to expand that. So we've already started moving into how to monetize automated driving. So that kind of takes us into the manufacturing piece. I work in manufacturing. Aptiv has kind of a strong history of innovation, continues to push the envelope for innovation. And as we look at what can we do in manufacturing to kind of transform things digitally, I wanted to start with a story. So a couple years ago when we started this journey, I was having a discussion with our lead data architect, and he was telling me about a previous job he had with one of the large casinos. And he was telling me how they collect all this information on your players' cards, right? So I know some of you that have been to any of the casinos and probably even the one right over here at Harris, you use your player's card and they give you different incentives to use it, but really they're collecting a ton of information like every other service out there, right? And so historically in a casino, the management would go out and say, you're a big player, you spend a lot of money, we're gonna assign a host to you. And the whole goal there obviously is to encourage that person to spend more money. If they're a $10,000 player, let's get them up to a $12,000, a $15,000 player. If they're a $100,000 player, let's get them up to $120,000. But that's a lot of resources to assign to driving your revenue up, right? So you're only going to do that on 1% of your people, maybe 5%. But what about the rest of the population? Maybe you hand out some coupons for the buffet or something else, right? Give them some little perks, But using all the data that they've started collecting on these players' cards, they can calculate a theoretical spending limit for each and every one of us. So if I go in a casino and I spend $100 and that's kind of my limit, they can look at the data and say, I'm a $100 spender. And so when I'm sitting at a slot machine, for example, and I get to about $90 on the slot machine of money that I've been putting in, they can send an alert over to the wait staff. It says, hey, Steve Hutchins is sitting at machine 26. He drinks Heineken beer, because that's the last one that he bought. Get him a Heineken right away. And they show up with a Heineken, and what do? I stay a little bit longer, you know? So the other creepy part of that was when I was socializing, you know, kind of this whole topic of using data in manufacturing, I was explaining that to some of our engineering leadership. And so one of the engineering leaders raises his hand and he says, hey, so what you're trying to tell me is if we put this system together, that when it's about 4:55, somebody's going to come by my desk when I'm getting ready to pack up and hand me a Coke? And I said, well, I never thought about it that way, but yeah, it's a creepy new world, you know, we're getting into, right? So, you know, when we look at the challenge in manufacturing, there are a lot of parallels. We have sites all over the world. We have machines that are generating all kinds of data. And what do we do with it? You know, historically, we've created this data. We've kept it in different places. But what do we really want to do with it? So our problem statement was, how do we put actionable insight into the right people's hands across the organization? You know, rather than just a lot of information for a lot of people and somebody else sorts it out, right? Historically, we've been capturing about over 2 million transactions across our sites. And a transaction is, we have a product that we're building, it goes into a machine, maybe it's the test, maybe it's a screw driving machine, maybe it's a process that does something to the part. So every time we touch that product, we're creating a transaction. And that, you know, will have a serial number, will have a timestamp, may have a fixture ID, may have pass-fail information, may have defect information. And so that information was spread across 74 servers all across the globe. And so if you want that information, you'd have to find the right person in the right plant, know which server to go to, know how to pull it up, and then somebody else might try to consolidate it. You know, if you had a regional manager or somebody globally that wanted something, you know how it works. You got to find all the spreadsheets and have somebody try to put it together, right? So as part of our discovery process, we had a few high-level issues that we had to figure out. You know, the first one was, how do we stream and co-locate all of this data globally? The other piece was, you know, how do we create a portal that allows us to put the right tools in people's hands wherever they are? Because historically, everything was tied to a server that was on the internet within the plant, that was accessible only to specific people. And then the other very key part was we needed a development partner. We kind of knew what we wanted. We had some general ideas, some general concepts, but we frankly needed a thought leader that could come in and say, look, we've done things similar to this, or we've done something like that, and also bring in, help us push the envelope of what was possible, right? So we had general ideas, and we needed some help with that, and we really needed an innovative leader to partner with us. So we ended up working with Hortonworks to put in a private data lake in one of our data centers so we can stream all of our data. And then obviously, we're using the Liferay portal, otherwise I wouldn't be standing up here talking to you. And then Youngsoft is the development partner that we continue to work with on some of these new innovations. So we aptly named the system Aptiv Intelligence. We had an initial planned user base of about 10,000 people. Now that's obviously a subset of our global organization because we were focusing just on manufacturing. I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, but as we've rolled this out, you know, there's been a lot of applications outside of manufacturing where we're looking at starting to use the same portal due to its flexibility. So our planned base was about 10,000 people, primarily focused on manufacturing and manufacturing support areas. So these are actually some screenshots from some of the original mock-ups. I think I made these in PowerPoint. And the idea was to get out there and say, look, we've got to come up with something that allows us to have a one-stop shop where we can get our global manufacturing data, that we can get our global intelligence, that we can get it on any device, that we can get it anywhere. And certainly to some people in the organization, this was kind of a stretch from what we've done all along because they said, oh no, you've got to be in the plant, you've got to be on the network, you've got to, you have a desktop or whatever, right? You've got to use your VPN connection on your laptop to get into that, So we, basically said, no, we, need to move in a different direction. So this is an infographic that we put together to kind of highlight to some of the people in the organization what we were doing. These were some of the modules that we currently have in the system, kind of with the slogan, global intelligence at your fingertips, to really change the paradigm from siloed information that was only available to specific people to get to where we had information that could be available to anyone, anywhere. And that certainly was a big change, because if you saw on one of the earlier slides, data security was also very important to us too. We simply can't just start broadcasting our production information globally. We had to have authenticated people, and then depending on the function, certain people need to have access, and certain others don't even need to know it's there. So with that, I wanted to highlight some of the use cases that we have. So one of the first ones we did was plant revenue and expense visibility. So like most large organizations, we have a very deep implementation of ERP and power users and all kinds of stuff. But when it gets down to kind of simple visuals and easy, quick visibility to some of the basic things at a plant level, it wasn't always so easy. So what a lot of the plants would do is each morning they'd have somebody in finance dig through all the systems, run some reports in SAP, and try to make sense in a simple overview for the plant staff in a daily meeting to say, this is where we are versus our revenue target to month, this is how we did yesterday. These key expense areas like scrap or overtime or rework expenses, packaging, et cetera. This is where we are versus the targets, where we expected. This is how we plan to roll things out. But that required a lot of data collection and manipulation each day by some people in finance. Then that visibility didn't last much beyond that meeting. If you had a regional leader or even somebody globally that wanted to look at how their product line was affected or otherwise, there really wasn't a simple way to do that. So this application allowed us to kind of pull that together in a very simple interface that they could access either on a mobile device, they could access from home if they wanted, if they were authorized. If they want to look at a certain plant, they could click on it and everything would update. If they want to look at a region, they could click on that region. If they wanted to look at certain product lines, they could drill down to that, et cetera. So really just trying to take data that was out there somewhere and really get it to the right people in a simple, intuitive way. Another big thing was visibility of this real-time production data. So I talked about these 2 million plus transactions. The information's out there. It's been out there on these 74 servers, right? And if you know how to get it, you could drill down and figure it out. But you got to get a hold of the right person on the right server, and it may not be real intuitive. So this is kind of one of the production areas, and each one of these areas is kind of a line, or a production line, and they go off to the left and off to the right. And each one of these displays represents a production line, if you will. So historically, what we did in most of our plants is there's a piece of paper at the beginning of the line, or maybe at the end of the line, and somebody on that line every hour would go by and get the numbers, and they'd write it on a sheet of paper, and they'd write down if they had any defects, and if there was downtime, they'd write down the defects. And at the end of the shift, somebody would come through, collect all the pieces of paper. This is probably a common theme in many plants around the world. So this, using the data that we're collecting globally, we essentially in the portal have a dashboard that they can pull up on the line that doesn't require any user interaction. We define which processes are associated with which cell. We associate cycle times to different part numbers. And the system will basically keep track. It knows we define what the shift structure is, et cetera. And so the system will basically tell them, this is where you are versus where you need to be. This is where you need to be by the end of the shift. If they do changeovers to different part numbers, the system adapts and understands what happened. It gives them a high-level visibility of their efficiency and also their quality. And there's various other charts, including one here that kind of call a heartbeat chart that's time-based. So this is like the previous 24 hours. And this one, at this point, is 15-minute increments. So the gray bar is how many they should have built during that increment, and the colored bars are what they actually achieved. And so you can see the differences here are usually because of cycle times. So this part had a different cycle time than this part, so whenever they change over. So this allowed the people in the area to focus less on spending time collecting data and actually doing something about it. At the same time, these tools were available for people. Let's say you had a supervisor that was in another plant, or they were at lunch and they wanted to just look on their phone to see what's going on. So the same information is available anywhere. The other piece of that was the system knows, sorry, let me go back to this real quick. The system knows, for example, that they didn't meet their goal here. So it knows, hey, you lost 10 minutes. Why? Well, unfortunately, the system's not smart enough yet to know always why. If it was a quality-related issue, the system will know because of pass versus fail. But if it's because they ran out of material or a person didn't show up at a job position, the system doesn't know, so they need to put that information in the system. But the system says, look, you need to account for some time, and that's what kind of this red, there's a red flashing button here. And they choose from predefined categories globally, multilingual, but globally. And then from that, it's kind of a standard process that most manufacturing sites use to essentially categorize what type of issues they had that affected their efficiency. But it allows for immediate roll-up across sites, across production areas, et cetera, and allows them to focus on fixing the problem rather than the many people that often were working on collecting data and consolidating it. Another one of our use cases was a global unit history. So historically, we have people at any of our customer locations. So we build products for mainly automotive suppliers, and automotive companies. And so we build products for just about every car company out there. And we have people out in the field that go out to support our products and other things. So historically, if there was a question with one of our products, they would get the product, they'd read the serial number, they'd type it into an email, or maybe call somebody on the phone if it's real urgent. That person would go to the plant, they'd try to pull up the information they could, et cetera. We're already collecting every transaction globally. And so we have a function that someone simply can either type, or with the native app that we have, they can take a picture of that and immediately get a view from the global database. So that allows anyone, anywhere, as long as they're an authenticated employee and have access to this application, they can immediately pull up a full history of that product, whether it was built yesterday, whether it was built in Germany, whether it was built in Mexico, doesn't matter. They put it in. If it was built 6 months ago, it'll pull it up. So we keep the billions of transactions that we had in our data lake for retrieval at any time. So it took a process that took hours at a minimum down to seconds. And then certainly people in the plants can also use this too as kind of a mobile scanner, if you will, to understand what's going on. Because even within a plant, in some cases we have multiple servers related to different products. So this other big piece that we're continuing to work and refine is targeted alarming. So in the original problem statement, I mentioned how our goal is to get to where we get the right intelligence to the right people. Targeted alarming is really the ultimate goal for a lot of these things. So it's really, how do we cut through this noise? So I know there's some people in here that have been to a manufacturing plant. How many people here have been to a manufacturing plant? And yeah, a lot of you. So you probably recognize a light like this. And so usually in any given manufacturing plant, there's a whole bunch of lights, right? And at any given time, there's a lot of lights flashing. Some are blue. I mean, I've been in some plants and you're not even sure what they mean. Flashing blue, what's the difference between a flashing red versus, I've been to some where there's a flashing green and a flashing red at the same time. What does that mean? So there's just so much noise out there, and every plant, kind of adapts to that and figures out what's maybe the most efficient way with the tools they have to get the job done. But it's not always the most efficient. And so, using the data, we wanted to figure out how do we cut through that. So if we think about a scenario where we have many plants and then we have many processes in plants, we also have a lot of people in those plants. We have a lot of different technicians. We have supervisors, managers, et cetera. One of the plants that I worked in, there were so many lights flashing in the production area, they didn't feel that people were paying enough attention to them that they duplicated all the lights in the cafeteria. So they had all these lights hanging down over their head while they're eating lunch, expecting that now they're going to jump up when the light flashes, even though you don't know what it's related to. So they put in a whole bunch more colors. One plant I was in, they had music. And it was kind of like the kind of music you hear in an ice cream truck, the real cheesy, electronic music. And every machine had a different song. So if you heard, one funny song, it meant this machine. You heard a different song, it meant another machine. So the first time I went in that plant, I didn't know what was going on, but the people there figured it out. So people figure these things out, but they're not always the most efficient. So historically, when you had alarms going off, all of these people hear the alarm. All the people hopefully have a process to narrow down who's supposed to work on it, but it's certainly not the most efficient. So with the use of the portal, we've identified which processes, which machines are related to which cells, which areas, which process technologies, et cetera. But then we also have extensive user personalization so that we now know that Steve Hutchins is in the system and he is a plant manager and he's associated with these cells and these are his work hours, et cetera. So now it's an issue of basically matching the problem to the specific person. And so we have, of course, SMS messaging and also email alerting, but because we also have a native app, we do push notifications too. So at this point, depending on the alert level, we set up different mechanisms. Maybe email if it's just for information, but if it's critical, we may have it go out by push notification. So what are some of the next steps? We have kind of a roadmap of a lot of things that I'd love to do, and I know we'll get there. But one of the next ones that I'm excited about is furthering our targeted alarming with location. So because we have a native app, we're able to pass along users' information on specifically which plant they're in, based on GPS. But even further, we want to take that down to the machine level. So by people having the app on their phone and passively traveling through a plant, we can now understand exactly where they are, in front of which machine, et cetera. So some of the things that we're doing with that are basically kind of asset control, but also targeting specific issues. So if, for example, you have two people that are qualified to fix an issue and one is closer to the machine, let's alert him. Or let's say that you have a plant manager that has kind of a dashboard of issues going on in the plant, and he's actually in a certain part of the plant. Prioritize those issues on his dashboard to say, this is what's going on in this area, rather than sorting through a list of maybe 50 issues. So that's the next area that we're just starting some work on. So with that, we got a few minutes for questions. And a picture of, I think this is outside Jackson Square. I think it's Muriel's Restaurant. If anybody's been there, it's a nice place to eat. But with that, I'd like to open up to questions. And if we've got some detailed technical questions, my friend Wes Kempa from Youngsoft is here. Yes, sir. I'm curious who organizationally owns this project. Yeah, so I technically am on the business side, but I'm in a role that I'm basically the liaison to IT. So my title is manufacturing IT, but so the business thinks I work for IT and IT thinks I work for the business. But basically, I pull the two together, and so the project is run through IT. But the business's role was basically to create the vision, drive the roadmap, et cetera. But it's an IT project. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So essentially, we started with trying to put ourselves, because I'm on the business side and I've spent pretty much my whole career in manufacturing, we basically tried to step back and say, with the technology available, how would I most efficiently want to do my job? Where historically, in a lot of cases, what we do is say, well, we're keeping the spreadsheet, how do we put the spreadsheet online? And we wanted to avoid that, so we kind of stepped back and said, okay, let's get some people together and figure out what's the most efficient way you'd like to do your job. And so some of the roadblocks that we've run into are things, expectations. I mean, when we first put this stuff together, people said, well, there's no way you're going to stream all this data and collect it all and do, do anything with it. It's too overwhelming. Some of the other things that we ran into, that people want to go back to their old operating system. And so I'd say some of our biggest struggles are getting people to go back and say, well, what's the ideal way to do this job? Forget about how you did it before. Forget about the technology for a minute. And in other cases, people come in and say, well, you tell me how I'm supposed to run this area. And it's like, no. What's your operating system? How do you want to run the area? And let's figure out how to best apply the technology. So, but I'd say in general, what we did was just go back and figure out, kind of a day in the life of how to run a line, what's the most efficient way, what's the best way that we want to alert people. And then the other user piece was very good point, because historically, people said, well, we can't do a mobile app because then we got to buy everybody phones, and it's like, and so we tried to break that mold by saying, look, we're not telling you have to buy a phone, but we want to put technology out there so that if it's easier for them to do their job by maybe using their phone 5% of the time, or that they set up their phone so they can receive a push notification, we're not telling them they have to, but if they choose to because it makes their job easier. So our goal was basically to do more with less, whereas we've had another division I used to work with, they would kind of start from the perspective of, if we have to throw more people at it to make a better process, and then we'll refine it. Our perspective we went in was an assumption that they're not going to use it unless I can show them they can use it more simply and with less resources.
I really like the targeting.
Yeah, and that's a key area for us that we want to continue to refine. So today it's mainly a subscription-based alarming, and we're modifying that so that it's much more targeted in that we'll know who is specifically in the area, what their job function is, et cetera. And so it's one that we continue to refine in an area that we see as one of our biggest payback areas to reduce the overhead that we have. Yep. You're talking about the graphs and other stuff that we have. So these are essentially custom developed charts using, I think they're AM charts. Well, one of the things that we did with the current charts that we have is we had some very specific charts and the way that we wanted to see them, that at least at the time, we felt the most flexible way was to custom develop these fixed charts, because it was for the 99% of the audience. And there is some work going on right now to do some other stuff, to use some different tools. We've been doing some work with, I think, ClickView and some other stuff that we were embedding. But when we did some of the initial work, to be honest, from a user's perspective, it felt very clunky. It was kind of like a frame within a frame, and it really didn't give the user experience that we expected across the different platforms. So we haven't given up on that yet, but that integration, and we've tried a few different ones. I don't remember all the names, but we have not gotten a seamless interface yet, and that's why for these specific charts that we use heavily, and they're very specific, we decided to custom develop those. Yeah, the other advantage we had with some of these was the fact that we're displaying some of these charts that I showed you across several hundred different dashboards that may be on devices that are logged in as kiosk IDs, also individual devices. So there's licensing issues and other stuff that caused the interfaces to be, I'll call it clunky from my business perspective.